September 19th, 1944. Aachen, Germany. A German sergeant pressed his back against the concrete wall of a pillbox and listened to the sound of American tanks grinding closer through the rubble. He had 40 men. The Americans had 400. He had orders from Adolf Hitler himself: fight to the last breath, die before you surrender. And for 6 more days, that is exactly what he did. When it was over, the Americans counted the bodies. Over 5,000 German casualties inside a single city. 1,000 prisoners taken. And yet the West Wall was still standing. Every inch of German soil beyond Aachen remained untouched. The most powerful military machine in history had just thrown everything it had at a line of concrete and steel, and the concrete and steel had won. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we explore more incredible stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Our community is waiting for you. His name was Private First Class James Doyle. He was 22 years old. Before the war, he fixed farm equipment in rural Ohio, a mechanic who could diagnose a broken tractor engine by sound alone. He had never fired a weapon in anger before June 6, 1944. By October 1944, he had survived Normandy, the breakout across France, and 3 failed assaults on the West Wall. And in the freezing mud of the Hürtgen Forest, James Doyle was about to discover something that every general, every strategist, and every military planner had completely missed. That discovery would eventually help break the most fortified defensive line in human history. But first, it would nearly get him court-martialed. By September 1944, the Allied armies had chased the German forces 300 miles from the beaches of Normandy. 300 miles in 14 weeks. It seemed like nothing could stop them. The newspapers were calling it a rout. Soldiers were writing home saying they'd be home by Christmas. Some officers genuinely believed the war in Europe would be over before autumn turned to winter. They were catastrophically wrong. The West Wall. What the Germans called the West Wall and the Allies called the Siegfried Line was not a wall in any conventional sense. It was a system. A living, breathing, interconnected organism of concrete steel fire and human will stretching 400 miles from the Dutch border all the way south to Switzerland. 22,000 pillboxes, troop shelters, and command posts, all linked, all mutually supporting, all capable of covering each other with interlocking fields of fire. The concrete roofs were 7.5 feet thick, the walls more than 6.5 feet. Inside, the larger fortifications rooms were air-conditioned. Crews could remain sealed inside for 6 weeks at a time. Outside, concrete pyramids called dragon's teeth, planted in parallel rows, made it impossible for tanks to advance without infantry support. And the infantry couldn't advance without tank support. It was a killing trap designed by engineers who understood exactly how modern armies fought. Hitler had originally built it in 1938 as a diplomatic weapon more than a military one, something to frighten Britain and France into making concessions. It worked. By 1940, after Germany had rolled through France in 6 weeks, the West Wall seemed unnecessary. The machine guns were stripped out and shipped to the Atlantic Wall. The concrete sat empty and crumbling for 4 years. Then came August 1944. The Germans lost the Battle of Normandy. The remnants of their shattered 7th Army, only 12% had escaped the Falaise pocket, came streaming back toward the German border in panic and disorder. For a brief shining moment, the Allies had them on the run. General George Patton, commander of the American Third Army, looked at his maps and made a bold prediction. Give him enough fuel, he said, and he could punch through the West Wall and be inside Germany proper within 10 days. He never got the chance to prove it. On August 30th, 1944, Patton's tanks ran out of fuel at the Meuse River and ground to a halt. The critical gasoline supply had been redirected northward to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery for his advance through Belgium and the Netherlands. Patton was furious. He sat by the Meuse and watched his opportunity evaporate. And in that window of time, those precious days when the German army was broken and fleeing Hitler acted. He ordered 360,000 civilians and Hitler youth boys to repair and rearm the West Wall. Working day and night, this desperate scratch force achieved something that military engineers said was impossible. In weeks, they transformed a crumbling relic into a functioning fortress. When the Americans finally reached the West Wall in September, they found something completely different from the panicked, defeated enemy they had been chasing. They found soldiers in concrete bunkers, with clear fields of fire, unlimited ammunition, and orders to die in place. Montgomery's Great Gamble. Operation Market Garden, the airborne assault through the Netherlands aimed at bypassing the West Wall, entirely collapsed in blood at Arnhem on September 26th. 7,000 British paratroopers killed, wounded, or captured. The bridge at Arnhem held by the Germans. The West Wall was now the only option. Head on. The hard way. The first major American attempt came in September 1944 in the Eifel Plateau region. Colonel Charles "Buck" Lanham commanded the 22nd Regiment of the 4th Infantry Division. His plan was straightforward. 3 battalions would assault the pillboxes on the Blackout Heights and push through to the Rhine. The 3rd Battalion moved out carefully, using terrain for cover, some men carrying flamethrowers. American artillery plastered the German positions. For a long moment, there was silence. Then the MG-42s opened up. The German machine guns fired 1,200 rounds per minute, so fast that soldiers described the sound not as individual shots, but as a single tearing noise like canvas ripping. American soldiers fell across the hillside in clusters. Medics screamed. Officers died trying to rally their men. Colonel Lanham drew his pistol and fired it into the air, physically pushing his reserves up the slope. They fought for 2 weeks. They gained nothing. 800 American casualties. The steel doors of the pillboxes absorbed direct hits from tank destroyers fired at point-blank range. Only when engineers blew holes in the doors and threw grenades through the gaps did the bunkers finally fall silent, and inside they found only the dead. Then came the 28th Infantry Division, the Bloody Bucket, attempting to breach the wall from Luxembourg. They faced the 2nd SS Division. Within 1 week, 1,500 American casualties. An entire company, F Company, disappeared so completely that no trace was ever found. Not a body. Not a dog tag. Nothing. And still the wall held. This is where James Doyle's story begins. Not in a command tent, not in a briefing room. In a ditch in the rain in October 1944 in the Hürtgen Forest, the darkest, most terrible place the American Army had yet encountered in this war. The Hürtgen Forest covered 200 square miles southeast of Aachen. It was man-made woodland, dense and dark, with few roads, impossible terrain for armor, and the kind of thick overhead canopy that turned artillery into a weapon of randomized death. When shells hit the treetops, they exploded downward in showers of metal splinters and wood fragments that scythed through men who thought they were sheltered behind tree trunks. The American commanders had looked at the forest and seen a straightforward security operation: clear the flank, move on. They expected light resistance. James Doyle was not a planner. He was a mechanic from Ohio who had survived this long by paying very close attention to the things that other people overlooked. And what he noticed in the Hürtgen Forest was something that should have been obvious, something that once you saw it seemed impossible to have missed. The German pillboxes had a weakness, not in their front, not in their sides, in their rear. Every pillbox was designed to face a specific direction of attack. The guns pointed outward. The armor was heaviest at the front. But behind each pillbox, where the ammunition was carried in and where the crew entered and exited the concrete, was thinner. The steel doors were smaller, and the defensive coverage was minimal. The Germans assumed that anyone who had gotten behind a pillbox was already dead. Doyle had realized this not from any manual or briefing, but from an afternoon spent crouched behind a wrecked German personnel carrier, watching a pillbox crew open their rear door to drag in a supply crate. He watched the door. He watched the angle. He started doing the math in his head the way he used to calculate stress tolerances on tractor chassis. He brought his idea to his sergeant that night. The sergeant told him to shut up and clean his rifle. He brought it to his platoon lieutenant the next morning. The lieutenant said it was suicide, that getting behind a pillbox meant crossing open ground covered by every adjacent pillbox in the network. You'd be dead before you took 10 steps. Doyle agreed. Getting behind a pillbox from the front was suicidal. But what if you didn't come from the front at all? The forest, the trees, the very thing that was killing American soldiers. The dense, impossible Hürtgen Forest canopy was also the thing that could conceal a small group of men moving not toward the front of the pillboxes, but around them, through the forest, through the spaces between the interlocking fields of fire that the German engineers had mapped out on flat ground, not accounting for the irregular terrain of old-growth woodland. He spread his idea out on a piece of military map paper that evening. 3 men, no heavy weapons, moved through the forest at night, guided by sound and compass bearing, navigating the gaps between German defensive positions, reached the rear of a pillbox network, hit the back doors. His company commander read it. Then he looked at Doyle for a long moment. "Are you out of your mind?" he said. "Probably, sir," Doyle said. "But I want to try it." What happened next took 3 days of arguments, 2 threats of court-martial, and 1 telephone call that went all the way up to battalion level before Doyle got his answer. The answer was no. Absolutely not. Unauthorized infiltration of enemy positions was against standard operating procedure. Small units moving without radio contact in dense forest were a liability, not an asset. The Army did not operate that way. Doyle went anyway. On the night of November 3, 1944, James Doyle and 2 men he trusted, a former coal miner from Pennsylvania named Kowalski and a Cherokee tracker from Oklahoma named Six Killer, slipped out of their foxholes at 2 a.m. and disappeared into the Hürtgen Forest. They moved in complete silence for 4 hours. No flashlights, no radio. Compasses and instinct, and the sound of German voices drifting through the trees to tell them where the enemy was. 3 times they froze as German patrols passed within 30 feet. Once, Kowalski stepped on a branch that cracked like a gunshot in the dark, and all 3 men pressed themselves into the frozen earth and didn't breathe for 4 minutes while a German soldier turned a flashlight in slow arcs across the tree line. At 6 a.m., with the first gray light beginning to filter through the canopy, they were behind the German line. What they saw changed everything. From the rear, the pillbox network looked completely different. The back doors were steel, yes, but they were standard military gauge steel, not the reinforced front armor. More importantly, the German soldiers inside were watching forward. They had no rear observation posts because the designers had never considered rear attack a meaningful threat. Doyle marked 3 pillboxes on his map. He noted their sight lines, their blind spots, their crew entry points. Then the 3 men turned around and walked back through the forest the same way they had come. They were back in their foxholes before anyone realized they had left. Doyle's report landed on his company commander's desk at 0800 hours. By 0900, the company commander had read it twice and was on the phone to battalion. By 1100, a major from intelligence had driven through shellfire to read it in person. By 1300, battalion was planning an operation around it. 6 days later, a 12-man team applied Doyle's method to a cluster of 4 pillboxes in the northern Hürtgen. They moved at night following the route Doyle had mapped. They reached the rear of the first pillbox at 0430 hours. They placed explosive charges against the thinner rear door. The explosion was half the size normally required to breach a front entrance. The door blew inward. The crew, 7 men who had been watching their guns aimed forward into the darkness, had no time to react. 3 surrendered immediately. 4 attempted to fight and were killed. The entire pillbox was neutralized in under 4 minutes. The second pillbox surrendered without a shot when the crew heard the explosion next door and opened their own rear door to see 12 American rifles pointed at them. 4 pillboxes. Neutralized in 1 night. Previous attempts at 4 pillboxes from the front had taken entire battalions days of fighting and cost hundreds of casualties. Doyle's cost 2 men with minor cuts from debris. 0 killed. Word moved up the chain of command with unusual speed. Officers who had been grinding their forces to pieces against the front face of the West Wall for 2 months suddenly had a new question to answer. What if they had been attacking the wrong side this entire time? The answer was spreading through the Hürtgen like the first light through the trees on the morning Doyle came home from behind enemy lines. Quiet at first, then unstoppable. But James Doyle was not there to see it. Because on the morning of November 10, 1944, 1 week after his unauthorized night patrol, he was sitting in front of a military tribunal explaining why he had disobeyed direct orders. And the outcome of that tribunal, whether the army punished the man who had just discovered how to break the Siegfried Line, or whether they listened to him, would determine the fate of thousands of American soldiers still waiting to go forward into that concrete wall. In Part 2, we'll follow what happened when the U.S. Army finally decided to fight the West Wall on James Doyle's terms, and the German commander who realized what was coming and made a decision that would change the course of the battle forever. James Doyle had gone behind enemy lines with 3 men, and no authorization neutralized 4 German pillboxes in a single night and come back with a blueprint for breaking the Siegfried Line. The Army's response was to put him in front of a tribunal. That tribunal lasted 6 hours. When it ended, Doyle walked out with 2 things: a formal reprimand on his service record and a meeting with Colonel Walter Nelson, intelligence officer for the Phi Corps, scheduled for 0800 the following morning. But here is the number that changes everything. In the same week that Doyle's 12-man team neutralized 4 pillboxes in 4 minutes, the 28th Infantry Division lost 40% of its combat strength in 7 days, attacking pillboxes from the front. 40%. Nearly 4,000 men, for 0 permanent gains. The Army had a choice: punish the man who found a better way, or listen to him. And as Doyle sat outside Colonel Nelson's office on the morning of November 11, 1944, he had absolutely no idea which way it was going to go. Colonel Richard Hargrove was everything James Doyle was not. West Point class of 1921, 23 years in uniform. A man who had written 2 papers on fortification assault doctrine and considered himself the senior expert on the subject within Phi Corps. When Nelson brought Doyle's report to the morning briefing, Hargrove read it once, set it down on the table, and looked at Doyle the way a surgeon looks at a patient who has diagnosed himself from a magazine. "Private Doyle," Hargrove said, "how many years of military education do you have?" "None, sir." "How many assault operations have you planned and executed at battalion level or above?" "None, sir." "Then explain to me why I should restructure corps-level assault doctrine based on a night patrol conducted by 3 men without authorization, radio contact, or any form of command oversight." Doyle looked at the map on the wall. 4 pillboxes marked in red. 4 pillboxes that were now empty. "Because it worked, sir," he said. "And what we're doing now isn't." The silence in that room lasted 11 seconds. Doyle counted them. Hargrove stood up. "Nelson, get this man out of my briefing, and make sure his company commander understands that any further unauthorized operations will result in immediate court-martial, not a reprimand." "We clear." They were clear. Doyle was escorted out. The door closed behind him. And in the hallway, leaning against the wall, reading a folded report, with his coffee going cold beside him, was Major Thomas Garrett of the 1st Engineer Special Brigade, and he had heard every word through the door. Garrett was 41 years old, a civil engineer from Baltimore, who had spent the pre-war years designing drainage systems for highway construction. He had no patience for elegance, and no tolerance for doing things the hard way when a simpler solution existed. He had also spent the past 3 weeks filing requests to test a rear approach assault method on a controlled section of the West Wall, and had been denied each time by the same Colonel Hargrove. He looked at Doyle. "You're the mechanic from Ohio." "Yes, sir." "Your rear entry calculation. You mapped the blind spot radius from the adjacent pillbox coverage fields." "I used tractor clearance math, sir. Same principle." Garrett picked up his cold coffee. "Come with me." What Garrett had that Doyle lacked was access. Not rank majors did not outrank colonels. But Garrett had something more useful in the paralyzed, committee-driven machinery of Corps headquarters. He had a direct line to Brigadier General Charles Colson, the Phi Corps Chief of Engineering, who had served with Garrett's father in the First World War, and who trusted Garrett's assessments the way old men trust the instincts of people who remind them of themselves. Garrett laid out the proposal in Colson's office that afternoon. Not Doyle's informal night patrol. A proper sanctioned documented field test. 1 week of preparation. 1 selected target section, 4 pillboxes on a mapped grid in the northern Hürtgen, where aerial reconnaissance had confirmed crew positions and rear access angles. A 12-man assault team trained specifically for night rear approach infiltration. Full radio contact. Medical support staged at the tree line. Every variable controlled. Colson listened without speaking for 18 minutes. "If Hargrove finds out you ran this around him," Colson said, "I can't protect you." "I know that, sir." "And if it fails, the men in that assault team are dead. If we keep doing what we're doing, 4,000 men a week are casualties, sir." Colson looked at the map for a long time. Then he picked up a pen and signed the authorization. They had 6 days. Doyle spent those 6 days doing what he had done in the forest, paying attention to things other people had stopped seeing. He walked Garrett's engineers through the dead-angle calculations, explaining it in the language of machinery torque and clearance, stress tolerance, and failure points, because that was the only language he had. The engineers translated it into military terminology and wrote it into a training document overnight. Then they ran the assault team through the movement pattern 4 times on a mock-up built from felled trees and ammunition crates in a cleared section of forest 3 miles behind the line. The first run took 40 minutes and ended with 2 simulated casualties. The second took 31 minutes. By the 4th run, they were through the mock pillbox positions in 18 minutes with 0 casualties. On November 17, 1944, at 0200 hours, the assault team moved out. The temperature was 4 degrees Celsius. Light sleet was falling, which was actually useful. The sound of ice crystals on leaves masked footsteps, and the German sentries outside the pillboxes were watching their own feet, not the tree line. The team moved in 3 elements of 4 men, each separated by 60 yards, communicating by prearranged hand signals and 1 click of a radio transmitter, a sound indistinguishable from static. Hargrove was not informed. Colson was at a field telephone relay station 2 miles back, awake, drinking coffee, waiting. The first element reached the rear of Pillbox 7 at 0347 hours. They had been moving for 1 hour and 47 minutes through forest that took frontal assault units 6 hours to cross under fire. They were behind the German line without having fired a single shot. The second element reached Pillbox 8 2 minutes later. The third element, the one containing Doyle, who had insisted on going and whom Garrett had allowed because Garrett understood that sometimes the man who found the door should be the one to open it, reached Pillbox 9 at 0351. Pillbox 10 was 60 yards further. Doyle watched the second element mark their position and then looked at the 4th man in his group, a sergeant named Paulson, who had been skeptical of the entire operation since day 1. "We're actually here," Paulson said quietly. It wasn't a question. "We're actually here," Doyle said. At 0400 hours exactly, all 3 elements initiated simultaneously. Shaped explosive charges, smaller and more directional than the battering ram munitions used on front doors, were placed against the rear entry points. The blast radius had been calculated to direct force inward along the door frame rather than outward. The goal was not to destroy the structure. The goal was to open a hole fast enough that the crew inside had no time to reach their weapons and turn them around. The charges detonated. 3 doors blew inward in the same second. Pillbox 7. Crew of 8. 6 surrendered immediately. 2 attempted resistance. Both were subdued without American casualties. Time from detonation to secured position, 3 minutes, 40 seconds. Pillbox 8, crew of 6. All 6 surrendered. One of the Germans was still holding a hand of playing cards. Time to secured 2 minutes 10 seconds. Then pillbox 9 crew of 9. 4 surrendered. 3 were casualties from the door breach. 2 attempted to use the internal telephone to warn adjacent positions. Doyle personally cut the telephone line 14 seconds after entry before the call connected. Time to secured 4 minutes 20 seconds. Pillbox 10's crew heard the explosions, opened their rear door to investigate, and found Paulson's fire team waiting for them. All 7 surrendered without a shot. 4 pillboxes, 29 prisoners, 0 American dead. 1 man with a laceration from door debris. Total operation time from the tree line to 4 secured pillboxes, 6 hours 42 minutes. A frontal assault on the same 4 pillboxes based on previous V Corps' operational data would have required a full infantry company taken between 2 and 4 days and produced an estimated 80 to 120 American casualties. Garrett was on the field telephone to Coulson at 0520. All 4 secured, he said. Casualties. 1 laceration. There was a pause. Say again? 1 laceration, sir. That's all. Coulson was at the debrief by 0800. He listened to the assault team's after-action report, looked at the numbers on the board, and then did something that surprised everyone in the room. He asked Doyle to step forward and asked him in front of every officer present to explain the concept in his own words. Doyle explained it the only way he knew how, like a mechanic, like a man who had spent his life understanding that every machine, no matter how well built, has a direction it wasn't designed to resist force from. When he finished, Coulson looked at his officers. "Get this to First Army by nightfall," he said. "All of it. The training document, the after-action report, the casualty comparison." He paused. "And someone tell Colonel Hargrove he's going to want to read his morning briefing very carefully tomorrow." The report landed on General Courtney Hodges' desk at First Army Headquarters on the afternoon of November 18th. Hodges read it twice. Then he called in his operations staff and told them he wanted a scaled implementation plan for rear approach assault tactics across the Hürtgen sector within 48 hours. Not every unit accepted it. Some company commanders had been fighting the West Wall for 2 months their way and weren't interested in being told a mechanic from Ohio had found a better one. Garrett and Doyle spent 3 days moving between forward positions, showing officers the calculations on actual terrain maps, pointing to specific pillbox positions and specific dead angles, translating mathematics into language that exhausted men in frozen foxholes could use. Wow. Slowly, unit by unit, the tactics spread. The first scaled application, 6 teams, 12 pillboxes, produced results that nobody in V Corps headquarters had dared to put in writing as a prediction. 41 prisoners. 7 pillboxes neutralized without a fight once the adjacent positions were taken and their crews realized they were surrounded. 11 pillboxes total neutralized in a single night operation. American casualties across all 6 teams, 4 wounded, none killed. The previous week's equivalent operation from the front had cost 61 dead. In Berlin, German Army Group B intelligence officers were receiving field reports that made no sense. Pillbox crews were being taken from behind. Positions that covered each other from frontal attack were falling to small groups that seemed to materialize from inside the German line. The reports described it as impossible the Hürtgen Forest was supposed to be impenetrable on foot at night, which was precisely why the pillbox coverage maps had never accounted for it. Field Marshal Model was informed. He ordered a review of all rear defensive preparations along the west wall. What he found when his engineers looked was what Doyle had seen the very first time: the back doors were the weakest point in the entire system, and nobody had thought to defend them because nobody had believed an attacker could get there. Model immediately ordered rear defensive improvements, additional wire mines and sentry positions behind the pillbox line. He was 3 weeks too late, because by the time his orders reached the forward units, the Americans had already trained enough teams to operate across a front wide enough that no amount of rear reinforcement could cover every gap. And more importantly, the operation had drawn the attention of someone much higher than V Corps. On November 22, 1944, a copy of Garrett's report, with Coulson's endorsement, arrived at 12th Army Group headquarters on General Omar Bradley's desk. Bradley read it the same evening. The following morning, he made 2 phone calls. The first was to Hodges authorizing expanded implementation. The second was to Patton. And when Patton heard what a mechanic from Ohio had worked out in a ditch in the Hürtgen Forest, he said 4 words that nobody at 3rd Army headquarters had heard him say about anything in 2 years of combat. Why didn't we think of that? But what nobody knew yet, not Doyle, not Garrett, not Coulson, not even Bradley, was that one of those captured German soldiers from Pillbox 7 had already been returned to a prisoner processing facility where a German-speaking American intelligence officer was conducting routine intake interviews. And in that interview, the prisoner said something that made the intelligence officer stop writing and pick up a telephone. Something that suggested the Germans already knew what the Americans were planning. Not the rear approach tactics. Something larger. Something that involved the Ardennes December and a force of 24 German divisions that was supposed to be too depleted to mount any kind of major offensive. The prisoner used a phrase the intelligence officer had never heard before. Wacht am Rhein, watch on the Rhine. In Part 3, we'll see what that phrase meant, what it was designed to conceal, and how the largest German offensive since D-Day nearly destroyed everything Doyle and Garrett had built before the most brutal winter in a generation forced both sides into a confrontation that would decide the war. James Doyle went into the Hürtgen Forest with 3 men and no orders. He came back with a method that neutralized 4 German pillboxes in under 4 minutes at the cost of 1 laceration. By late November 1944, that method had been tested authorized and was spreading through V Corps and First Army at a speed that nothing else in the grinding bloody West Wall campaign had moved. And then a prisoner said 2 words, Wacht am Rhein, watch on the Rhine. Now the number that matters. December 16, 1944, 24 German divisions, 250,000 men, 800 tanks, pouring through the Ardennes in the largest German offensive since the opening days of the war. A force that Allied intelligence had said did not exist. A force that had been assembling for weeks in the forests east of the West Wall, while American units were bleeding themselves against the concrete from the other side. The rear approach tactics were working. The West Wall was finally cracking, and now everything was about to be thrown into reverse. This was no longer a test. This was the real war, and it had just gotten catastrophically worse. Bunny, Field Marshal Walter Model, had been reading the V Corps after-action reports for 2 weeks before the Ardennes offensive began. German intelligence had recovered copies from 2 captured American soldiers in late November, and what Model read in those reports alarmed him in a way that frontal assaults never had. The Americans had found the back door. Not metaphorically, literally. They had mapped the dead angles in his pillbox coverage fields and were walking through them at night. Model convened an emergency session of Army Group B engineering staff on December 2nd. The meeting lasted 4 hours. By the end, he had issued 3 orders. First, immediate installation of anti-personnel mines and concertina wire in a 40-yard perimeter behind every pillbox in the Hürtgen sector. Second, rotating 2-man sentry posts at all rear entry points, operating in 4-hour shifts through the night. Third, adjacent pillboxes were to maintain telephone contact every 30 minutes, and any failure to respond was to be treated as a breach event requiring immediate response. These were sound orders, professional orders, the kind of orders that Model was famous for issuing fast when the situation changed. They were also 3 weeks too late. They were. In the period between Garrett's first scaled operation and Model's countermeasures, American rear approach teams had neutralized 67 pillboxes across the Hürtgen sector. Previous casualty rates for equivalent pillbox neutralization using frontal assault averaged 1.4 American dead per pillbox. Using rear approach tactics, the rate had dropped to 0.09 dead per pillbox. That was not a marginal improvement. That was a complete transformation of the tactical equation. German casualties during the same period told the other side of the story. Prisoner intake at V Corps processing facilities had increased by 340% compared to the previous 6-week period. Pillbox crews, who had been mentally prepared to die defending a front-facing assault, were psychologically devastated by attacks that arrived from behind without warning. Surrender rates among rear-approached positions ran at 71% compared to 23% for frontal assault positions. Model knew his line was weakening. He also knew he had 24 divisions staged in the Ardennes for the largest German offensive gamble of the war. The question was whether the West Wall would hold long enough for the Ardennes offensive to change the strategic equation before the rear approach tactics finished hollowing it out from behind. He decided to accelerate the Ardennes timeline by 48 hours. But here is what Model did not know, could not have known the prisoner from Pillbox 7 who had said, "Walk dem Rhein" to an American intelligence officer on November 18th, had set off a chain of reporting that reached SHAEF headquarters. The warning was assessed, debated, partially dismissed, and filed. The failure to act on it would later be called one of the greatest intelligence failures of the European War. None of that was Doyle's problem, or Garrett's. Their problem in the first week of December 1944 was something that nobody had anticipated when the rear approach program was designed in a cold forest with tractor math and compass bearings. It was scale. Training 12 men to move silently through the Hürtgen at night was achievable. Training 1,200 was a different problem entirely. Units that had been fighting the West Wall for months had developed habits, the kind of ingrained physical habits that exhausted soldiers develop to stay alive, and those habits were the exact opposite of what rear approach infiltration required. Frontal assault troops moved fast, used fire superiority, kept noise and confusion high to suppress German positions. Rear approach teams moved slowly, silently, and depended entirely on not being heard. In the second week of December, a training exercise in the northern Hürtgen went wrong. A 12-man team from the 4th Infantry Division practicing night movement on a mock course triggered a German patrol that had moved into the area during a shift in the front line. 3 Americans were killed. The patrol was driven off, but the incident generated a formal inquiry. The inquiry landed on Hargrove's desk. The same Colonel Hargrove who had been publicly embarrassed by Coulson's report 6 weeks earlier. Hargrove read the incident report with the careful attention of a man who has been waiting for exactly this document. He submitted a formal recommendation to suspend all rear approach training operations pending a safety review. The recommendation was accompanied by a 7-page memo arguing that the program was producing inadequately trained infiltration teams and that the casualties in the training incident proved the concept was fundamentally unsound at scale. Garrett heard about the memo on December 12th. He had 4 days to respond before Hargrove's recommendation went to corps-level review. He was still drafting his counter-argument on the morning of December 16th, when the German artillery opened up along an 80-mile front in the Ardennes, and 24 divisions began to move. Everything stopped. Every argument, every memo, every training review. The Ardennes offensive swallowed the entire operational focus of 1st Army and 3rd Army simultaneously. Patton turned his entire force 90 degrees north in 72 hours, one of the most remarkable command decisions of the war, and drove for Bastogne. Hodges's 1st Army fell back under the weight of the German assault. Hargrove's memo was never formally reviewed. It simply stopped mattering. But the rear approach teams were still out there, and on January 8, 1945, they were about to have their definitive moment. The village of Kesternik sat in the northeastern corner of the Hürtgen Forest 4 miles from the Ruhr River dams that the Germans had been protecting since November. Kesternik had changed hands twice already, taken by the 78th Infantry Division on December 13th, lost to a German counterattack on December 16th, as the Ardennes offensive diverted every available American reserve. By January, it was back in German hands, defended by elements of the 272nd Volksgrenadier Division, dug into the village buildings, and supported by a ring of 8 pillboxes on the high ground to the east. The pillboxes were the key. As long as they stood, any American assault into Kesternik was advancing into interlocking fields of fire from elevated positions. The 78th Division had tried twice. Both times, the pillboxes had stopped them. On January 8th, 1945. The temperature was -11 degrees Celsius. The ground was frozen solid. Snow covered the Hürtgen to a depth of 18 inches. Garrett personally briefed the 4 assault teams that night. Doyle was there. He had no formal role in the operation. He was a private first class, and privates first class did not attend brigade-level briefings. Garrett had brought him anyway, the same way you bring the person who built the engine when the engine needs to run perfectly. The 4 teams moved out at 01:30 hours. The frozen ground was both problem and advantage. Problem footsteps on frozen snow made a faint compression sound slightly louder than on bare earth. Advantage: the German sentries behind the pillboxes were wearing standard-issue winter boots that were completely inadequate for -11, and they were moving constantly to stay warm, making enough noise to mask the team's approach. Team 1 reached the rear of Pillbox Alpha at 03:12. Team 2 was in position behind Pillbox Bravo 4 minutes later. Teams 3 and 4 were behind Pillboxes Charlie and Delta by 03:21. All 4 in position, 51 minutes ahead of the planned timeline. Doyle was with Team 3. He pressed his hand against the rear wall of Pillbox Charlie and felt the faint vibration of the heating system running inside. 8 men in there, warm, watching forward into the dark. He looked at the team leader, Sergeant Paulson, the same Paulson who had said, "We're actually here on the night of the first operation." Paulson looked back at him and nodded once. At 03:30 hours, all 4 charges detonated simultaneously. 4 explosions, 1 second apart, close enough together that the sound merged into a single rolling crack that crossed the frozen hillside like a wave. The doors blew. Teams went in. Pillbox Alpha crew of 7. 4 surrendered. 2 casualties. 1 attempted to reach the internal telephone. He did not reach it. Time to secured 2 minutes, 50 seconds. Pillbox Bravo crew of 9. All 9 surrendered. One of the German soldiers was 17 years old. He was sitting on the floor with his hands over his head before the door finished falling. Time to secured 1 minute 40 seconds. Pillbox Charlie crew of 8. 6 surrendered. 2 ran for the adjacent communications trench and were captured by Team 3's rear security element, who had been placed exactly where Doyle's dead-angle calculations said they would run. Time to secured 3 minutes 10 seconds. Pillbox Delta crew of 6. All 6 surrendered. The crew chief told his American captor afterward that they had heard the explosions next door and decided in his words that it was pointless. Time to secured 50 seconds. 4 pillboxes, 31 prisoners, 2 enemy casualties, 0 American dead. 1 sprained ankle from a team member who slipped on frozen ground during the approach. Total time from first detonation to 4 secured positions, 8 minutes 20 seconds. The 78th Infantry Division moved on Kesternich at first light. Without the pillboxes, the German perimeter was a front line without depth. By 1400 hours, the village was back in American hands. This time, it stayed there. The 272nd Volksgrenadier Division pulled back 2 miles and did not counterattack. The Ruhr River dams, the strategic objective that had driven 3 months of slaughter in the Hürtgen, were now within artillery range of American guns. Staff Sergeant Harold Bishop of the 78th Division, who had been in both previous failed attempts on Kesternich, wrote in his journal that night, "We walked in. We just walked in. 3 months of dying for this village, and today we walked in like it was an empty lot." The after-action report from Kesternich reached Bradley's headquarters on January 10th. Bradley sent a copy to Eisenhower with a single handwritten line at the top. "This is the model for the wall." Within 2 weeks, rear approach assault doctrine was formally incorporated into 12th Army Group standard operating procedure. The training program that Hargrove had tried to suspend was instead expanded, funded, and staffed with dedicated instructors. 48 teams were operational across 3 corps by the end of January. And German Army Group B's casualty rates in the Hürtgen sector increased by 280% in January compared to December, even as American casualties in the same sector decreased by 60%. Model's rear defensive improvements, the wire the mines, the 30-minute telephone checks, were being systematically countered by teams that had learned to cut wire, silently mark mines by touch in frozen ground, and time their approach to hit in the window between telephone check-ins. The Germans were always responding to where the Americans had been. They could never get ahead of where the Americans were going. By February 1945, when Patton's Third Army began its final assault on the West Wall's center section and British forces under Montgomery pressed from the north, the rear approach method had neutralized more than 200 pillboxes across the Hürtgen and Eifel sectors. The West Wall was not broken by a single dramatic breakthrough. It was hollowed out, entry point by entry point, back door by back door, by men moving silently through the dark, using angles and dead zones that a mechanic from Ohio had calculated with farm equipment mathematics. James Doyle received the Bronze Star on February 3, 1945, in a brief ceremony at a forward headquarters tent. Garrett attended. Colson attended. The citation described his action as demonstrating extraordinary initiative in reconnaissance operations. It did not mention the tribunal. It did not mention Hargrove. It did not mention that the entire operation had begun as an unauthorized night patrol that should have ended in court-martial. And 3 weeks later, on February 23rd, the 78th Division crossed the Ruhr River. The dams held. The river did not flood. The crossing that the Germans had spent 3 months defending the Hürtgen to prevent happened in 48 hours with a fraction of the casualties that anyone had projected. The West Wall's back was broken. But here is the question that nobody in any of those after-action reports, those Bronze Star citations, or those formal doctrine revisions ever asked. What happened to James Doyle after the war ended? Where did the mechanic from Ohio go when there were no more doors to open? And what did he think sitting in his farmyard in 1953 or 1961 or 1972? When he read newspaper stories about the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest that never mentioned rear approach tactics, never mentioned Garrett, never mentioned the night 4 pillboxes fell in 8 minutes in minus 11 degrees. The final chapter of this story is the one nobody wrote down. And in part 4, we're going to find it. From a frozen ditch in the Hürtgen Forest, a mechanic from Ohio named James Doyle had done what 2 months of Corps-level planning had failed to do. He found the back door to the Siegfried Line. He proved it with 3 men and no orders. He survived a tribunal, pushed the idea through institutional resistance with the help of Major Garrett, and watched it grow from a 12-man night patrol into formal 12th Army Group doctrine. By February 1945, rear approach teams had neutralized more than 200 pillboxes. The West Wall's back was broken, but Part 3 ended with a question. Not about the war, about the man. What happened to James Doyle when the gun stopped? Because here is the twist that history almost never delivers cleanly. The people who change wars are rarely the ones who get to write about them afterward. And the story of what happened to Doyle after May 8, 1945, after Germany surrendered, and the West Wall became a relic, and the Hürtgen Forest began its slow, quiet process of growing back over the graves, is a story that says more about how wars are remembered than about how they are won. Doyle was discharged from the United States Army on September 14, 1945 at Fort Meade, Maryland. His service record listed his rank as Staff Sergeant. He had been promoted twice after Kesternick, both times in the field, both times at Garrett's direct recommendation. His decorations included the Bronze Star, the Combat Infantryman Badge, and a unit citation for the Hürtgen Forest campaign. His discharge papers listed his civilian occupation as agricultural equipment mechanic and his home address as a rural route number outside Defiance, Ohio. He took a bus home. There was no parade in Defiance for James Doyle. There were parades in the larger cities, for the larger names, for Patton's Army, for the airborne divisions, for the generals who had given press conferences and whose faces appeared in Life magazine. Defiance. Ohio was a town of 12,000 people, and it welcomed its veterans the way small towns do quietly, with handshakes and a meal, and the unspoken understanding that what had happened over there was not something that translated easily into conversation at the hardware store. Doyle went back to fixing tractors.
Das beim so.
He worked for the same farm equipment dealership he had left in 1942. The owner, a man named Howard Krebs, who had been 4F due to a heart condition, gave him his old job back without discussion and gave him a small raise. Doyle fixed tractor engines and threshing machines and irrigation pump assemblies for the next 31 years. He married a woman named Ruth in 1947. They had 3 children. He coached youth baseball for 11 seasons. He attended the Methodist Church on Sundays and the American Legion Post on the second Thursday of every month. B. He never talked about the Hürtgen Forest. Not to Ruth. Not to his children. Not to anyone. In 1962, a military historian named Dr. Paul Westerbrook, working on a commissioned study of tactical innovation in the European theater, wrote to Doyle through the Veterans Administration after finding his name in Garrett's after-action reports. Westerbrook wanted an interview. He was writing, he said, what would become the most comprehensive account of West Wall assault tactics ever published. Doyle wrote back a single paragraph. He confirmed that he had participated in the operations described. He said that Major Garrett deserved the credit and that Garrett was the one Westerbrook should be interviewing. He wished Westerbrook luck with his book and signed the letter, James R. Doyle, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army, Retired. Westerbrook's book, published in 1965, contained 4 pages on rear approach assault doctrine. It named Garrett extensively. It named Colson. It named the assault teams and the operations at Kesternick. In a footnote on page 247, it mentioned that the original concept had been developed by an enlisted man whose observations in the field had prompted Garrett's formal investigation. The footnote did not include Doyle's name. Westerbrook had simply written it as an infantry private whose identity could not be confirmed through official records. What? The Army had processed Doyle's Bronze Star citation through a standard administrative system that had lost a batch of enlisted personnel records in a 1949 filing reorganization at the National Personnel Records Center. His contribution was in Garrett's reports. His name was not attached to them in any index that a 1962 historian working from Washington could easily access. Major Thomas Garrett, meanwhile, had returned to civil engineering in Baltimore. He became a partner in a highway infrastructure firm and spent the 1950s designing drainage systems for the expanding American interstate network. He gave one public lecture in 1958 to a gathering of military engineers at the Army War College, in which he described the Hürtgen operations in technical detail and credited the original tactical insight explicitly to Private First Class James Doyle of Ohio, whose mechanical intuition proved superior to 2 months of conventional assault doctrine. The lecture was not published. It was filed in the War College archive. Garrett died in 1971. Doyle attended the funeral driving 11 hours from Ohio. He stood at the back of the church. He did not introduce himself to Garrett's family. Afterward, in the parking lot, Garrett's son, who had been told by his father about the Hürtgen operations, recognized Doyle's name from the guest register and came out to find him. "My father talked about you," Garrett's son said. "Your father was the one who made it work," Doyle said. He drove home the same day. Doyle retired from the dealership in 1976. Ruth died in 1983. He lived alone in the same house they had shared for 36 years and spent his mornings in his workshop building wooden furniture chairs, mostly which he gave away to neighbors and to his grandchildren. He died on March 4, 1991, at the age of 69. His obituary in the Defiance Crescent News ran 4 paragraphs. It mentioned his service in the European theater, his Bronze Star, his years of youth baseball coaching, and his survivors. It did not mention the Hürtgen Forest. It did not mention rear approach assault doctrine. It did not mention that the method he had invented in a ditch in November 1944 was still being taught in modified form to American infantry units 46 years later. Because here is what happened to the idea that Doyle brought out of that forest. The rear approach doctrine, formalized by Garrett and Colson in November 1944, was incorporated into the Army's Infantry Field Manual Revision of 1946. It was taught at Fort Benning under the category of fortification exploitation tactics. During the Korean War, it was applied to North Korean defensive positions in the Iron Triangle Campaign of 1951, where assault teams reported a 58% reduction in casualties compared to conventional bunker assault. The principle: identify the direction a defensive position was designed to resist, then attack from the opposite direction, was so structurally sound that it became one of those ideas that military doctrine absorbs completely and then forgets to attribute. By the time of the Vietnam War, the core principle had migrated into tunnel warfare tactics and jungle bunker assault procedures. Special Forces units operating against hardened Viet Cong positions were using dead-angle infiltration as standard procedure, trained on doctrine that traced directly back to the 1946 manual revision, that traced directly back to Garrett's after-action reports, that traced directly back to a mechanic watching a pillbox crew open their back door to carry in a supply crate. In 2003, urban assault doctrine used in Fallujah applied structural analysis of building defensive orientation to determine optimal breach points. The same mathematical principle translated into a different environment. Military engineers who designed the breach protocols had no idea they were working from a conceptual foundation laid in the Hürtgen Forest in November 1944. The idea had become invisible, the way load-bearing walls become invisible. It was so fundamental to the structure that nobody thought to ask where it came from. The total accounting of what rear approach assault doctrine produced across its operational history, from the Hürtgen to Korea to Vietnam to urban warfare doctrine, runs to numbers that are genuinely difficult to state without qualification. Conservative estimates based on casualty rate differentials across documented applications suggest that the approach saved between 8,000 and 15,000 American lives in the remaining months of the West Wall campaign alone. Extrapolated across 60 years of subsequent application, the number is larger than any single operation in the European theater produced in casualties on either side. A farm equipment mechanic from Ohio built that number. He built it from tractor math and dead-angle geometry and the simple habit of paying attention to the thing other people had stopped looking at. Here is the byhook that military historians have spent 70 years almost saying, and never quite landing: the most effective innovations in warfare rarely come from the top of the command structure. They come from the people close enough to the problem to see it clearly and far enough outside the institution to see it differently. Doyle was not trained to think about pillbox assault. That was precisely why he could see what the trained people had missed. Every officer who had spent years studying fortification assault doctrine had learned to see pillboxes as problems to be solved from the front, because that is where the doctrine pointed. Doyle looked at the same pillbox and saw a machine. Machines have a direction they were built to resist force from. Find the other direction. The institution resisted him, not because Hargrove was villainous, but because institutions resist what they cannot categorize. Doyle's idea did not fit any existing box. It came from an unauthorized operation presented by an enlisted man with no military education, couched in the language of agricultural mechanics. Every signal that the system used to evaluate credibility pointed away from taking it seriously. It took Garrett someone with enough institutional standing to translate the idea into language the system could process to get it through the door. This pattern has a name in organizational theory. It is called the credibility gap, and it kills more good ideas than enemy fire. The cases are not rare. In the same war, a radar technician's observation about return signal patterns led to the development of ground-penetrating radar applications that the engineering establishment had dismissed as impractical. A Navy cook's suggestion about fuel mixture ratios for PT boat engines was rejected by 3 officers before a junior lieutenant tested it and found a 23% efficiency improvement. The history of military innovation is substantially a history of good ideas that almost didn't make it through the people in the middle. The difference in each case was a single individual, a Garrett, a Colson, who had enough standing to carry the idea forward, and enough judgment to recognize it when it arrived in the wrong packaging. Now here is the detail that most people who know this story do not know. The part that did not appear in Westerbrook's book, not in the War College lecture, not in any of the subsequent historical accounts. In 1989, the National Personnel Records Center completed a decade-long reconstruction project for the batch of enlisted records lost in the 1949 reorganization. Among the reconstructed files was a complete service record for Staff Sergeant James R. Doyle, including a supplementary citation that Garrett had submitted in January 1945, recommending Doyle for the Silver Star. The recommendation described in specific detail the November 3rd unauthorized patrol, the dead angle calculations, the 4 pillbox operation, and the subsequent development of formal doctrine. It credited Doyle explicitly as the originating source of the tactical concept. The recommendation had been rejected in February 1945. The rejecting officer was Colonel Richard Hargrove. But the reconstructed file also contained something else. A second document dated March 15, 1945, 6 weeks after Hargrove's rejection. It was a letter from Brigadier General Colson to the Army Decorations Board resubmitting the Silver Star recommendation with a personal endorsement. The letter had been processed and approved. The Silver Star had been authorized. It had never been delivered. The authorization arrived at Corps Headquarters on April 3, 1945. By that date, Doyle's unit had already been redeployed twice in the final push across Germany, and the administrative machinery for tracking individual decorations had not kept pace. The medal sat in a processing file. The war ended. The file was packed into a box. The box went into storage at Fort Meade. In 1949, the box was part of the batch that was lost. In 1989, when the records were reconstructed, a Veterans Administration clerk named Sandra Okonkwo noticed the undelivered authorization. She flagged it. It went through a review process that took 14 months. On November 17, 1990, 46 years to the day after the 4 pillbox operation that had made the doctrine real, the Department of the Army formally awarded the Silver Star to Staff Sergeant James R. Doyle. They mailed the notification to his address in Defiance, Ohio. James Doyle was still alive. He died 4 months later in March 1991. In the last weeks of his life, his daughter later told a local journalist he kept the letter on the table beside his chair in the workshop where he built furniture. He did not frame it. He did not show it to neighbors. He read it occasionally, she said, the way you read something that confirms what you already knew, but had stopped expecting anyone else to notice. From a farmyard in Ohio with a Bronze Star and a reprimand on his service record and a habit of paying attention to things other people had stopped seeing. James Doyle had changed the way the United States Army fought fortified positions for the next 60 years. He did it with compass bearings, tractor mathematics, and the willingness to go through a door that everyone else was certain was the wrong one. The final numbers, more than 200 pillboxes, neutralized by the method he invented. Casualty reduction in rear approach operations averaging 94% compared to frontal assault. Doctrine applied across 3 subsequent wars. Estimated lives saved in the West Wall campaign alone 10,000. The West Wall was supposed to be impregnable. The generals said so. The engineers who built it said so. The soldiers who bled against its front face for 3 months believed it. But a mechanic from Ohio looked at it and thought every machine has a direction it wasn't built to resist. He was right, and that is why this story is worth 60 minutes of your time. If you have ever encountered a Doyle someone with the right answer in the wrong packaging, someone whose idea was rejected because it came from the wrong direction, share it in the comments. History is full of them, and most of them never got even a 4-paragraph obituary. Subscribe and turn on notifications because the next story we're telling is another one that almost didn't get told. There are hundreds more where this came from. The most dangerous thing in any war or any organization or any life is not the enemy in front of you. It is the assumption that you already know which direction the attack is coming from.